Welcome to a special bonus episode of HPP as Drew Barton and myself, Rich Harris, will be interviewing a basketball legend, Len Elmore. Len graduated from the University of Maryland in 1974, where he was a three-time All-ACC selection and an All-American in 1974. He is still Maryland's all-time leading rebounder in both total rebounds and rebounds per game. The 13th overall pick in the 1974 draft, he played a total of 11 years in the ABA and NBA. Following his playing career, Len earned a JD from the Harvard Law School in 1987, and since then, his numerous projects and endeavors have included practicing law, serving as the president of the National Basketball Retired Players Association, working as a broadcast analyst for ESPN, CBS, Fox, and others, and serving on the board of the Knight Commission on Intercollegiate Athletics and teaching at Columbia University. Welcome, Mr. Elmore. May I call you Len?
Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yes, we were very honored. I believe I have your rookie NBA card or your rookie ABA card. I don't know which it is. There was 1 year they made them oversized. I don't know if you were aware, that they made them.
That was the second year. The first year in the ABA was a normal size card. Our second year.
Oh, okay. So I have
oversized card.
I missed both rookie seasons.
Oh, Rich.
Well, I have the card. All right. So in 1974, you participated in what many have called the greatest game in ACC history. Both teams were ranked top 5 in the country. NC State defeated your Terrapins 103-100 in the championship in overtime. And the Wolfpack would go on to win the national championship, beating Bill Walton and UCLA and John Wooden, of course. Unfortunately, at the time, each conference could only send one team. And so your team was left out of the process. This actually forced the NCAA to expand the tournament eventually. But your team featured 6 NBA prospects and is probably considered the greatest team ever to not make the tournament. So when you look back, what are your most vivid memories from that great season? You finished 4th in the country that year. And what are your most vivid memories from that game? And how often do you look back on that game and that season and say, if only?
Well, to answer those questions kind of in sequence, it was a great year for our team. Obviously, we tried to finish strong. Our first game of the season was against UCLA at Pauley Pavilion, and we lost by 1 there, which probably means we won by 10 on a neutral site. But that's a whole other story. And Bill Walton, who had just came off of an almost perfect game against Memphis State in the championship the year before, shot 23 of 24, I think, from the field. That was my challenge. And, I certainly remember watching the tape of that Memphis State game all summer. So I pretty much think I was ready for it. And then I remember that game, the first 2 plays went to Walton. He got both shots blocked, got me up in the air and drew a foul on the third one. And that's on the cover of Sports Illustrated, a December 1973 cover. But Bill shot 8 for 24 that game. I wound up having a double-double, I think, like 19 and 15. But and Bill, that's no mistake, he had 27 rebounds, but he never left the paint. So that accounts for that. But unfortunately, our 2 stars, Tom McMillan and John Lucas, didn't have the games we would expect from them. And still, we outscored them down the stretch 9-0, only to lose on a last-second play. Hand check by the late Dave Myers that was right in front of official Booker Turner, whose nickname was Booker Bruin at the time. So that tells you a little bit about that story. But that was how we started our season. Went on to reel off a bunch of games in a row. Obviously, our arch nemesis was NC State. And throughout that year, they were ranked number 1 in the nation, and we were ranked anywhere 2 or 3. And, we just couldn't get over the hump with them. Their biggest difference was David Thompson, who, at that time was the best player in college basketball. And, maybe for his period, the greatest player during that time. And then when we get to, as you mentioned, the ACC tournament, here we are in the championship game, knowing only one team was going to go to the NCAA tournament. It was heartbreaking to lose to them in overtime in Greensboro, North Carolina. As I say, I still look at the free throw discrepancy and, realize that something was wrong. And that, just as an aside, the ACC tournament was always held in Greensboro, North Carolina. And, normally one of the big four, Wake, Duke, Carolina, or NC State, would win it. The first year they moved it out of North Carolina, which was 1976, lo and behold, Virginia wins. So that kind of tells you something. But nevertheless,
was that Ralph Sampson?
No, that was Wally Walker and a bunch of not really well-known people. It was kind of an upset. But in the end, that was our season. We were invited to the NIT, but we turned it down because my sophomore year we won the NIT.
Right.
People don't realize that was Maryland's first national championship, not the 2002 championship. And the NIT still was pretty highly regarded back in 1972. Obviously today people don't look upon it as anything meaningful, but back then it was relatively meaningful. And, so we took pride in that. And my senior year, we decided it's time to go back. A couple of us prepare for, the tournaments later on that would help scouts decide who would be drafted in the NBA. Others, would go back to class and hanging out on the mall and throwing frisbees. So that was that was a memory of that particular year.
All righty. I'm going to pass the next question over to Drew.
Hey, Mr. Elmore, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. It's really exciting for myself. It was fun to go back and kind of look at the history of the league and, your role in all of that. And so as we're talking about kind of basketball in the 70s, there was another heartbreaking situation, obviously, with the 72 Olympic team. I know you yourself weren't on that squad, but I know your teammate Tom McMillan did play. And we just had a lot of questions for you surrounding it. It was obviously a controversial game with, the loss to the Soviet Union. And I was just kind of curious if you were invited to the tryouts. How did Bill Walton and I believe Bob McAdoo didn't make the team either? And, were you glad to not have to be involved in that process? And, have you talked to Tom about it? And what are his thoughts about, again, a controversial loss to say the least?
Well, first of all, initially I was not invited, and then I wound up getting an invite, but, I turned it down for, what I would consider political reasons. During that time, we still were in kind of activist mode. Our country was still involved in Southeast Asia. And also, quite honestly, I wasn't a fan of Hank Iba. So for a number of reasons, things that I had heard from people around it. So, I didn't really put a lot of stock in playing in the Olympics and representing my country. Obviously, as you get older, you realize the importance of it. But at that time, I thought, that the activist element was more important. And, a person that I admired very much, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who did not play in the 68 Olympics for that reason, it kind of stuck in my head. But, speaking to Tom, Doug Collins, who's a friend of mine, at the time we played in a bunch of postseason tournaments together. A couple of other guys, reckon Mike Bantam, who was also on that team, they obviously will still not accept the silver medal because they obviously know that game essentially was taken away from them. The rug was pulled out, and the highly politicized Olympics was something that, quite honestly, when you look at 72, also overshadowing all of that was the horrific murders of the Israeli athletes. And you put all those things together, and honestly, I was glad that I was not there. And for whatever reasons I had, and be certainly mournful of those Israeli athletes. But in the end, I think that many of those guys, and another friend of mine, Kevin Joyce, was on that team as well. Kevin Joyce was a great player for South Carolina. who were teammates with the Indiana Pacers. They don't speak of it a whole lot. I think it's a huge sore spot for them, recognizing that they deserved a gold medal, and as I said, had it snatched away from them. But I think what it did was highlight the politicization of the Olympics. At one time, they didn't want to politicize utilizing the platform for protest, as we saw in '68, but all of a sudden it became political, as the Soviet Union flexed their muscles with judges, et cetera. Nobody really seemed to have a problem with that. So I think going forward, the Olympics realized that there are a lot of changes in place. And, to this day, obviously, the United States also had a couple of wake-up calls even beyond that with regard to their dominance in Olympic basketball. And, now we're back in an area where, I think that people respect that, this is our game and we're going to continue to be dominant, although the world has caught up drastically to the point where we're highly competitive. So
after college, you were a first-round pick in both the NBA and ABA, and your pro career began with the Pacers. And before the merger, you were in the ABA for 2 seasons. I've always thought personally that the ABA and NBA were on par. And in some ways, given that they had the 3-point line, they were ahead of the NBA in certain ways. But I just recently read this, that in the head-to-head games, now, of course, these were exhibition games, but the ABA had a 62-34 record against the NBA, almost beat them two out of every 3 games. So what are your thoughts on the ABA experience? Do you feel that the quality of basketball was similar? Should those records, be treated the same, looked at the same? And I wondered also, did all the antitrust laws, the player contract issues of the day inspire you to go to law school?
No, I'll answer the latter first. And that I didn't want to be a lawyer since I was in elementary school. I was a child of television, and I watched shows like Perry Mason and The Defenders and shows like that where, the lawyer was the hero. The lawyer was the voice for the voiceless and gave power to the powerless. And, I was growing up during the civil rights movement and during protests against our presence in Southeast Asia. And, I thought that you could make a difference. I wanted to be in the parade, as I say, as opposed to being a bystander. So it really didn't have any impact. And that's not the kind of law that I practice with regard to antitrust. Not so much, although I was a sports agent for a period of time and did get involved in some of the collective bargaining issues. But, going back to the comparison of the leagues, we always believed that the ABA was better. We had better athletes. The brand of basketball was wider, more wide open because of the 3-point shot, creating driving lanes. That's how you would see the athleticism, the extraordinary athleticism of people like Julius Erving, among others. George McGinnis, who's a Hall of Famer as well, who was my teammate my first year. He was LeBron before LeBron came along, with that size, the strength, and the versatility that he demonstrated. Could shoot the 3, could drive to the basket, could rebound, could dish dimes. He was a tremendous player. You look at David Thompson, as I mentioned before. So a ton of athletes, populated the ABA rosters, particularly towards the end. The merger occurred in 1976. Unfortunately, in 75, my last year in the ABA, the last year of the ABA's existence, I averaged almost 15 and 11, and really expecting to make my mark on the NBA to kind of show them. But I wound up popping a ligament in my right knee. I severed my medial collateral, and I missed all of the beginning of the season. Tried to play, only could come back for 6 games in January, wearing the Nicholas brace, which was the same brace that Joe Namath and a lot of football players wore, and you just can't play with that thing on. And so I wound up missing the rest of the season. But one of the measurements of, at least in my mind, one of the metrics was when you took a look at the 1977 All-Star game. and look at the representation of the four teams or guys who had played, four teams or guys who had also played the ABA and wound up on NBA teams, there was a huge representation of those former ABA players, which told you that, obviously the talent was certainly on par. And yeah, I do believe the NBA, obviously, since they took the lead role with regard to the merger, I think that they should include the ABA records. When you take a look, I'm only giving credit for like 8 years instead of the 10 years that I played. And I kind of feel again that we are being, kind of cheated out of a legacy of a terrific league that spawned so many great players. I mean, you look at the way the game is played now. I think it's taken a step beyond the way we played it, to the point where, unfortunately, I'm not a big fan of, shooting three after three after three. Back then, we used it more judiciously, but nevertheless, it's still that's the heritage of the 3-point shot, beginning with the ABA. And the reason I said I wanted to show the NBA before, while I was still in top form, was that being drafted by the Washington Bullets at the time, I was kind of lowballed in the offer. And that's because, and many NBA teams did that, believing that there would be a merger, but not understanding that there were some teams that were financially solvent, like the Indiana Pacers, and who made me an offer with regard to the amount and the length of years security that just blew the Washington Bullets offer out of the water. And they did that simply because they thought that no ABA team could make a better offer. And I think that was a huge mistake for, a lot of the teams drafting in that year, 1974. And, hence a lot of guys migrated to the ABA.
Okay. Drew?
First and foremost, I'm glad to hear someone kind of in agreement. People always argue with me when I say the 3 ball is a little bit distorted the game. I just look at the Minnesota Timberwolves series, shooting a 28-foot 3 ball with 22 seconds left on the shot clock. It drove me and my dad insane. So Len, you mentioned that you played in the NBA for 8 seasons, and you kind of touched base on this on the last question, so I'll change it up a little bit here. But as you got closer towards the end of your career, and as the 80s were starting to come around, and obviously you had, the Larry Birds, the Magic Johnsons, the Michael Jordans entering the league, the NBA business was changing. I guess, how did your views on basketball as a business change throughout your transition from the ABA to the NBA, and then you really started to see the NBA, David Stern, making these pushes to highlight these star players, star teams, star matchups into the model that it is today?
Well, I mean, you could see it occurring. I mean, it hit the nadir in the late 70s, right before Irvin Johnson and Larry Bird came along, where the playoffs were on tape delay. Here we are. You take a look at the playoffs today in prime time and, drawing the viewership that it does. But back in those days, we'd play the game and then we could go home and watch it after the nighttime news, because there wasn't that much interest in it. And you could see that necessarily something had to change. And so the business of the sport, when Johnson and Bird came across, the emphasis now became more on the individual as opposed to the team, star quality, if you will. And that's where I guess America was going, the cult of personality. And I think the NBA tapped into that extremely well. I think, again, not only is the 3-point shot overdone, I think that's overdone right now as well. But that's just an old guy talking about changes that they don't understand. But in the end, I think that I saw and we saw the changes come about. There's so many, and the reasons were pretty simple. The league became blacker and blacker. There were issues with regard to drug use and some other things that the people really felt was turning off the viewership, and changes had to be made. And kind of the personality and the wholesomeness, if you will, of a guy being called Magic And of course, Larry Bird being representative of Middle America, I thought they did a pretty good job of highlighting, all of that and, making it something that would attract either casual viewers or people who weren't viewers at all, and brought them into the fold with regard to the new type of NBA where you had Showtime, versus, tradition in the Boston Celtics. So, when you guys are talking about this, and Drew, I can hear it in your voice. I'm sure you're paying a lot of attention to winning time, right?
I mean, I take it with a grain of salt. That was my dad's era of basketball. So, he's like refused to watch it up to a point. And then I sat down and said, hey, Dad, look, let's just sit down and watch a couple episodes together. I was against it. And then about 3 episodes in, he went on this is horrible. What is this? Where is the, and I was like,
well, there's definitely poetic license taken, but I get a kick out of them portraying some of the guys that I played against and some guys that I played with actually. I watched that show, and I don't mean to digress, but you watch that show and I start to realize probably the only person who's happy with their portrayal right now is probably Pat Riley. And even then,
I said the same thing.
And even then, it demonstrated some duplicity on his part, right, which I'm sure he's not proud of. But quite honestly, there's a long story, but I've had some experience with that too. But again, I don't want to digress. You guys continue to ask the question.
From playing in New York City as a kid all the way through the NBA, who were some of the greatest players that you faced? Some of the players that you think back of that, maybe we do recognize them already, like, Kareem, or maybe somebody that might surprise us.
Well, believe it or not, I never played against Kareem in the playgrounds, in the record tournament, or anything like that, because he obviously had reached the pinnacle where he didn't have to come back there. But, there are some guys that you probably hadn't heard of, two in particular that we played against. So my high school team entered the record tournament in the unlimited division. So we got to play some of these guys. And once I got to college, I never really had to go back to New York and play because they had such competitive playing at Lefty Drizel's camp. When at nighttime, all the great players in the Washington, D.C. area would gravitate to Cole Fieldhouse after camp was over. And, our team, Maryland, would be able to play against some of the great players from the DMV. But going back to the record tournament, a guy by the name of Joe Hammond, people need to take a look at Joe Hammond, who was a legend in the record tournament during that particular time in the late 60s. Another guy by the name of Pee Wee Kirkland, who, had a reputation of, being a gangster, but also a great player. These are names that you probably wouldn't have heard of before. And certainly playing against great high school teams like Boys High. I mean, we were Power Memorial and we had a reputation of our own, but the guys who played for Boys High, the guys who played for DeWitt Clinton, you could name just about, any number of guys from that school, from those schools, to be, outstanding players. And even within high school, in Rice High School, I'll tell you, a guy that I played against that never went on to be much of a basketball player, but was a hell of a baseball player, was John Candelaria, who he was a pitcher for the Pittsburgh Pirates. Yeah. But he played basketball for LaSalle High School. And, John, he was a good player. Although it was funny because I'm watching him pitch one day and I hear Kurt Gowdy say, yeah, and Candelaria averaged 20 points and 20 rebounds in high school. And I'm scratching my head. I don't think so. You know better than that. But yeah, going back to the Rucker, people need to look up Joe Hammond. Joe Hammond was such he kind of dropped out of school, his claim to fame was a statement he made. Ultimately, the pros offered him a contract and he purportedly turned it down. And his statement, his so-called statement was reported to be that, I make more money slinging. So, it's something to think about. Pee Wee Kirkland was a guy who, I'm not sure if he did get any pro opportunities, but, he's the kind of guy that would come to a game in a Rolls Royce. He was dressed like Walt Frazier, Clyde, would take off his stuff and go out there on the court and play and destroy everybody and get back in his car with his entourage. It was some amazing stuff, back in the day. It was an extraordinary experience playing on the playgrounds in New York. I mean, that's where I started playing. I was a baseball player until about the 9th grade. And, one day my junior high school PE teacher, a substitute PE teacher, saw me goofing around in half court with some of my classmates in junior high school. And I was at least a foot taller than many of them, and asked me, "Don't you want to play against people your size?" And I said, "Sure, why not?" And so one day we get in a car and we drive to Power Memorial, and unbeknownst to me, it was a tryout. I didn't know much about the rules of the game. So we're now playing full court. And of course, in the center jump, they jump it up, they tip it, and people take off. And I'm still standing at half court. I said, how do you guys know which way to run? Because literally, I only knew how to play half court basketball. But it was after the offer was made and my parents, wanted me to go to parochial school from an education standpoint that, I started to immerse myself in the game. I played a little bit towards the end of my junior high school career. And then in the 10th grade, entered Power Memorial. And, my sophomore year was a total learning experience. And so when you talk about the Rucker tournament, between my sophomore and junior year, it was an even greater classroom where, I learned, I utilized instincts like anticipation and, the athletic ability that I had as a baseball player and played a little football. And ultimately, became a pretty good defensive player and a rebounder. And it wasn't until between my junior and senior year that I started to polish some offensive skills, just enough to be dangerous. And that's when the offers started coming in. And, I'm proud to say I probably could have gone to any school in America because of the combination of athletic ability as well as education. So, I chose Maryland after turning down St. John's, where I originally wanted to go, but Lou Carnesecca decided he wanted to coach the Nets, and Lefty Driesell and George Raveling kind of swooped in and kind of dominated my recruiting process, even though I visited a lot of schools just to be sure. But, Maryland was an idyllic place, had an idyllic campus, the kind of campus you dream about when you think about going to college. And even though it was still the South, there were so many Northeasterners there that, made me feel pretty comfortable, and the rest is history.
Just a quick follow-up. Was George Raveling part of Lefty's staff?
Yeah, George took the lead on recruiting. To this day, I consider him a mentor.
Well, that was going to be my next question.
Yeah.
Drew?
So stepping away from your career as a basketball player and kind of transitioning to the time you spent broadcasting, I know that you've been an analyst for more than 30 years, and you were on the call for one of the most memorable basketball games of all time. Like I said, my dad and uncle, they never shut up about it. The legendary, the 92 East regional final between Duke and Kentucky, where obviously Leitner hits, a great kind of, full court pass into a fall away jumper for the win. And, what was that moment like for you to, be away from the action on the court, get to observe that? I can only imagine what the arena and the energy was like. And have there been other games in your career that kind of rivaled it, or is that one of the standout, if not the standout moment?
Well, I've been fortunate during the NCAA tournament to cover a number of really quality, entertaining, competitive games. I can think of UCLA and Gonzaga. I can think of Syracuse and Vermont. We're talking about upsets. We're talking about drama. And of course, what increases the drama is the person sitting next to me, the play-by-play guy. And, obviously one of my favorites is Gus Johnson. But, I've also had the great pleasure of working next to another pro, different, a little more understated in Vern Lundquist. And it was Vern and I that did the game between Duke and Kentucky. And really, you didn't feel the import. I mean, during that moment, you felt the excitement and the drama. But when you look at the overall game, one of the things I definitely remember saying is that, we're on the cusp of seeing a new type of player now, somebody who's big, but also versatile, can shoot from the perimeter, not relegated to the post. And the two guys I was talking about was Leitner and Jamal Mashburn, on the Kentucky side, who again, could take you off the dribble, could shoot the ball from distance, but could also post you up, could rebound offensively. That was a new type of basketball player. And it was good to be able to see that. Now, as far as the end of the game, and also Grant Hill, who, how can I forget, Grant was that kind of player as well. The thing about that game was down the stretch, it was nip and tuck, coaches playing chess. I remember Sean Woods taking a shot to put Kentucky ahead, and it was the craziest shot off balance, but he made it. And I remember saying, "Boy, that was a bad shot," but it went in. Sean Woods a couple of years ago reminded me of that with a twinkle in his eye. But we wondered, why Rick Pitino didn't put a man on the ball and gave Grant Hill, the clear vision to throw the ball in the air. And then that in the huddle, he had to have told his guys no fouls, because when the ball was in the air, instead of going after the ball, which everyone is entitled to the ball when it's in the air, instead of going after the ball, his guys backed away and allowed Leitner to catch it. And I can still see John Pelfrey step backwards for a moment instead of crowding Leitner and making that shot more difficult. And Leitner just turned around, wide open look. By the time hands went up, he had already had it lined up and shot it. And remember, he was perfect from the field that game. So, you take your hat off to him for that type of play. As I said, the rest is history. It was an amazing moment, but the more you look back on it, the more you realize, what type of game it was. I was, after the game, I was excited, but I was even more excited because that was my 40th birthday, and my wife and my youngest son were there at the game as well. He was like 2 years old, cheering. He ultimately wound up playing basketball in high school, played a little bit in college, but also was a baseball player at Princeton, and wound up playing basketball at the Citadel for a year in his fifth year. But those are the things that were more important at the time. When we got back on the train to go back to New York, go back home, I didn't talk as much about the game as we talked about the atmosphere.
I regrettably, I lived in the Philadelphia area at the time, had tickets for that game, and for unknown reasons, decided to sell them. And I remember still watching that game on my own couch with my girlfriend's head on my lap. She was snoring. And I'm like, I could have been there.
Yeah.
Rich, I've never been more disappointed. I've never been more disappointed in all the episodes, interviews we've done. Oh, Rich, how could you not go to that game?
Oh, I really don't recall why I ended up selling tickets. I really don't.
I don't know. As somebody who loves going back and, I like to study the history of basketball, especially college hoops. Can't imagine.
I can vividly remember everything, every detail about that room, about my couch and everything. It was just, I just so much regretted. I knew I was watching history. But anyway, so moving on to the next question. I'm going to name 6 players that I feel are underappreciated. Several we've already talked about. 4 of the 6 had their careers cut short. 3 did not make the NBA's 75th anniversary team, which I hope we don't get too much into because I'll get on a rant. Please give me your thoughts about the guys on this list. I'll go through them one by one, and feel free to add to this list too. But number 1 on mine, and I've never understood to this day. I don't know how much you're aware, but it seems like a daily occurrence. People debate who's the greatest player of all time between LeBron and Michael Jordan. And to me, this man's name should be there too. But I didn't really see him play much. I know I believe his career ended before you got to the NBA. But we're talking about Wilt Chamberlain. And I heard an interesting stat the other day. They were talking about Karl Anthony Towns scoring 60 in a game. And before they made too much of a big deal about it, he did it once. Wilt did it 32 times. There's 31 players in the history of the league who scored 60 or more, and Wilt was one of the 31, and he did it 32 times. The next is Kobe with 6. But and we could go on. We could have a whole show just about Wilt's records. They're amazing. I only remember seeing him once, and it was against Kareem when Kareem was with the Bucks. And I was very little, so I really couldn't even, give you a breakdown of that game. So why do you think Wilt is not in that discussion? Are his records somehow skewed, or was he that good?
Not enough documentation of what he did and who he was. And today, so many voters are of a certain era that if they haven't seen this individual and haven't seen much of them, they kind of forget them. I've always said that when people are judging the greatest of all time, they want to own the moment. And so they're owning the moment that they've witnessed, as opposed to, broadening it to consider history. So I these lists and stuff, I don't put any stock in those, because that's who's making the determination, people of recent vintage. I remember someone saying that history in sports didn't start until 1979. That's when ESPN came online. So, I mean, that to me is the reasoning. But absolutely, Wilt, based upon, his impact on the NBA. I mean, when you start changing things as tangible as, the width of the lanes, when you make those kind of rule changes because of one individual, that individual was highly impactful and probably, was the most dominant person in that particular era. And remember, his era spanned 50s, 60s, and 70s. So there's no doubt about it. Wilt Chamberlain has to be considered the greatest, or has to absolutely be in the conversation. And the same thing with Kareem. When you talk about the greatest college players and NBA players as well, the no dunk rule, which, had a profound impact on me and my game and my era, as none of us were able to dunk in college during that particular time. People love to watch these young players dunk today, but in our day, you still had to make a layup. That's how you scored. Yeah, you had to use the backboard, or you found a way to get to the rim and lay it in, and that's a little more difficult than just basic dunking the ball. So to be able to maneuver around a defender to get to the basket and still just drop it in instead of using, the power of the dunk. So there are, great players in that era as well. So yeah, I think that a lot of it has to do with, voters either being present or having the history documented. 50s, 60s, and 70s, there wasn't a lot of film and very little television for people to relate to if they choose.
The next player on my list is Connie Hawkins, another player that I'm hoping that he was a New York guy, I believe, wasn't Connie from New York?
Yeah. Brooklyn,
and
New York,
right, and he was Dr. J before Dr. J, as I hear it. His career was unbelievably cut short by not only things beyond his control, but also, I believe, injuries later on in his career. What would you like to say about Connie Hawkins?
Yeah, I mean, I think you characterize it perfectly. Everything that Dr. J did, Connie Hawkins had done with those types of moves, with his length, with his grace, and obviously his sheer athleticism. He was a legend in the playgrounds. Unfortunately, this association with gambling, which was non-existent, but nevertheless through innuendo, never allowed him to get into the NBA. There's obviously a point of discrimination that could certainly be made at that time. And when he finally did get his chance, he was kind of towards a downhill in his career from an age standpoint. And I'm sure he wasn't in the condition that he needed to be in order to have a sustained career. That's why the injuries cropped up. So, yeah, I mean, Connie Hawkins is one of those names that, people don't really know, particularly in this generation, but certainly when they see the fluidity of some of these players and utilizing, as I said, their length and athleticism, those of us who know and remember have to think of the Hawk.
Right. The next person on the list is somebody who I think controversy kind of followed him around a little bit. And that's Pistol Pete. I know a lot of players didn't. I don't know. Maybe you could put it in better. Maybe you could describe that situation better. But the one thing that I've always found interesting about Pistol was, I mean, as we know, he averaged over 40 a game at LSU for his career. But somebody at LSU's sports department went back and looked at the tape, and they said he would have averaged over 60 if there was a 3-point line. So, not knowing Pistol at all as a person and just watching his game, it was a thing of beauty. And so what are your thoughts on Pete?
Well, I admired the guy. I mean, I got to know him a little bit because, during the summer camp circuit, I'd see him and his dad press, coming, always giving, the clinics on ball handling particularly, and to some extent shooting, but mostly ball handling. They had a ton of drills that everybody copied, even to this day. He doesn't get credit for some of these drills, but those are drills that his father, who was his coach at the time, really, really press people to get involved in doing. And, I would have loved to have played for him because he was a guy that was pretty unselfish. If you were open, he was going to find a way to get the ball to you. And, his unorthodox passes were oftentimes on the money, but he just played with a flair. And guys that were his teammates certainly loved playing with him, and guys who were opponents had to marvel at his ability to get those off. And yes, he shot with range, and he had a brand, the floppy hair, the floppy long socks. But Pete was, as a person, he was a good guy, a good teammate. There are a lot of copycats, out there that played, similarly. It was just a shame he doesn't get more credit for essentially what he started. The behind the back pass. I know they say Kuzi started that, but there are a lot of guys that perfected it, and I think Pete Maravich is the reason for it. The bounce pass and some of the other stuff. I know one guy who was similar in that vein was Ernie DiGregorio.
Yeah.
I got to play with Ernie and some of the the USA basketball teams. That's how I characterize them now, where we traveled throughout the country playing against foreign teams like the Soviet Union, who came in the year after they stole the silver medal. They came to the United States to play in a tour, and I was on the team with Ernie and a bunch of other guys, and we wound up in a 7-game series against them. I think we wound up winning, beating them 4 games to 3, or even 6 games, 4 games to 2. But it was fun playing with him. But Ernie was reminiscent of a Pete Maravich. But overall, Pete demonstrated his ability, his capability in the NBA, and for anybody who denigrates his capabilities, I don't think they were watching very closely.
Well, no, I didn't mean that. I thought that there was a lot of hard feelings about the contract money, especially his rookie contract.
Well, I mean, look, that's the nature of sports, pro sports, and you can make that argument to this day to some extent.
Right.
Yes, I mean, one of the reasons why Pete was a draw and he could command that money was the leverage that he had as a great white player. I mean, let's face it. And I don't hold that against him. I hold it against the business and the owners who felt that there was a need for that, and I guess there was a need for white players. I remember the controversy with the Phoenix Suns, who to this day, at least among players, if you couldn't be a bench warmer and play for the Suns during the 70s, simply because the ownership didn't think that they could draw having black players on the bench. If you were black, you had to be a starter. You're that good, and then they could populate the rest of the bench with white players, people with whom the fans could identify. So they tried to balance winning, with drawing and popularity and branding, et cetera, of their team. So there were a lot of arguments about situations like that, a lot of controversy.
Are we talking about like the Alvin Adams, Westfall, the Van Arsdales?
Yeah, talking about
That era?
That era. Yeah.
And the only black player that's coming to mind is Gar Hurd.
Yeah, Gar Hurd, Ricky Sobers came a little bit later.
Right, I remember him.
And a couple of other guys after that. But yeah, when you think about it, how many any black players that were on that team had to be starters.
Right.
They had to be that good in order to play for that team. And that was based upon, and we heard an argument like that several years ago from an owner or former owner of the Atlanta Hawks, who thought that one of the problems that they had was that there are too many black patrons coming to watch the game, and it kind of frightened away the white patrons who actually spent more money on a per cap basis. That was the excuses.
Who said this?
One of the owners, former owners.
I was going to say, better be a former owner.
Yeah. No, he took his lumps, but he certainly said it.
Huh. All right. Moving on to the next guy on our list, and I'm going to get flack for saying this, but I believe he was MJ before MJ, and his name already's come up several times, and that's David Thompson. So what are your thoughts on David? And I know that I believe that his career was kind of cut short, was kind of self-induced. But still, he was the most magical player I remember from my childhood until I saw Dr. J.
Yeah, no, David was probably the most dominant player for 2 years in college basketball. His sophomore and junior year, my junior and senior year. As I said, he was the difference why we could not beat NC State during that period of time. He was the most difficult matchup. And going back to winning time, they had some reference to him. Do you put a big on him? Do you put somebody smaller on him? And that was our problem. And for those 2 years, he had impact on what everybody on that team did. But we ultimately, in that championship game, because he had scored 40 points against us several times, because we would always put someone 6'7", 6'8", thinking that they could match him and challenge his jump shot, but he would elevate above. And certainly it was his elevation. It was a 42-inch vertical at the time was tremendous. Since then, I mean, these guys are jumping way beyond that. But at the time, that was kind of unheard of. And so, trying to put a big guy on him, but he would outmaneuver them with his quickness and still able to score. And we finally decided how we were going to play him, where I would, kind of play a one-man zone in the paint and point towards him and try to deny him access to the paint. His teammate, Tom Burleson, the guy I was guarding, 7'4", winds up having the game of his life, because when the ball swung to the other side, here he is, 7'4". He's now in the paint, and I can't push him out because the rules don't allow that. And, he winds up scoring 30-something points against me, where in the past, he had never done that. I mean, the game before that, he shot 3 of 19. So I had him bottled up pretty well, but this time it was just too difficult. And we still went to overtime and wound up losing in overtime, despite that game of his, because we shut David Thompson down, or considered shutting him down. But he was so dominant because of that. Now, of course, the year I graduate, the following year, his senior year, they're playing Maryland, and a much smaller Maryland team, and Lefty decides to put a guard on him. And the guard, Mo Howard, one of my close friends, denied him, got up and overplayed him and denied him the ball. They shut him down, and Maryland beats NC State. So, he finally figured it out. It was a little too late for us.
Right.
But David was probably the most dominant player of that era. And, unfortunately, when he got to the pros, he for whatever reason, and he'll say it, I mean, the drugs caught up with him. And, it really was a knee injury. According to the story, he was high at Studio 54 and fell down a flight of steps and injured his knee and never could recover from that. So, it was certainly related, but it wasn't direct a direct issue of
Right.
drugs. It was an injury that was caused in part by his condition.
Right. Okay, next guy on the list, we've also mentioned several times. Everyone now just considers him a wacky guy on TV, but the first dominant player I remember as a child, and I really didn't like him because he always won, and that's Bill Walton. So your thoughts on Bill?
I like Bill. I mean, Bill is, before we played that game, he and I got together. I don't know if they were trying to, try to disarm me or whatever, but, he was friendly and, a good person. Our political views were relatively similar. As a player, he was an outstanding man playing in the middle. The only thing was, again, as a defensive player, I studied, what he did, his tendencies and everything. So I had some success against him. And throughout the pros, when we matched up together, he never was able to dominate me, but it seemed like everybody else, though, for some way, shape, or form, he'd get the best of him for a period of time. Unfortunately, injuries had some impact, adverse impact on his career. And sometimes it makes people scratch their heads. He certainly deserves to be in the Hall of Fame because of his college exploits, but I'm not so sure his pro exploits. They did win a championship, and he had a heck of a year that year, but throughout his career, it was more about injuries than it was about performance. And so, people still scratch their heads and debate, how is he in the Naismith Hall of Fame based on his pro career?
Right. Understandable. Now, here's probably what I consider the biggest slight off the NBA's all-time 75. And we're talking about another fellow ABA player, Artis Gilmore, in college, averaged 20-20, took his team to face Jacksonville to face UCLA in a
Actually, Walton wasn't on that team.
Oh, he wasn't?
No.
Oh, it was Sidney Wicks. Okay.
Yeah.
My apologies.
And Curtis Rowe.
Right.
And the reason I know that is because I was there. That was played at Cole Fieldhouse in Maryland, that championship game. And that was the day that I signed to go to Maryland, lefty engineer.
Nice.
So all of the media attention during the off day, they had nothing else to do in between the semis and the finals. And so they focused on, my signing along with one of my high school teammates.
Nice. Very nice.
But Artis, I will say this, that, he was one of the strongest guys I ever played against. It may be because his game wasn't pretty, but it was effective. We lost to him in the Kentucky Colonels in my rookie year after upsetting San Antonio and the Denver Rockets. We lost to Kentucky in the ABA finals that year. And then the following year, we lost to them in the first round. And Artis was so dominant from rebounding, strength on the post. You couldn't move him. He was big, strong. And, he was lefty, and it certainly helped him as a left-hander to be a big man. I tell people all the time, left-handers have an advantage because you're so accustomed to playing right-handers. And, when your instincts tell you to put your hand up and stuff, you're missing them. But he's the kind of guy, and I'm puzzled too, Rich, about why people don't respect his game even more. I mean, from San Antonio to Chicago Bulls, he was just a guy who you could not uproot out of the middle with his strength, and could rebound and play defense with the best of them. So, yeah,
I looked Basketball Reference. If you look at win shares, it's a complicated metric, but number one of all time's Kareem, number two is LeBron, number three is Wilt. And you go down the list, all people on the list, and then at number 11 all time is Artis Gilmore, ahead of Oscar Robertson, ahead of Shaq, ahead of Dr. J, ahead of Kobe Bryant, and yet somehow they just totally ignore him. Rather amazing.
And it tells you sometimes that this is as much a beauty contest once you nail it down to those who are deserving. So as much a beauty contest is based on anything measurable.
Right. All right, Drew. I'm sorry. That was
No.
That was a long one.
I love NBA history, and I'll do you one better than win shares. If averaging 19 points and 12 rebounds a game across 17 years isn't good enough to get you in the top 75, I don't know what is. Right. Personally. No, I love NBA history. I mean, these are guys that obviously are way past my time, but you hear the stories and everything. And this kind of ties to my next question, which is a bit of a two-parter. The NBA is obviously, and basketball as a whole, has shifted to a much more analytical game over the years, where it's becoming a lot about these advanced numbers, win shares, players' defensive, offensive ratings, PER, all these really advanced numbers that a lot of people don't understand. And Len, I just want to get your thoughts on that as someone who played during a time and has kind of watched that evolution, both as a player and as a broadcaster. And then, on the flip side of that, though, are there some, young players, new generation players that you really do enjoy watching, though?
Well, I'll say this about analytics. I mean, there are places for it. I mean, in the most rudimentary fashion, we've always dealt with analytics in basketball. Coaches look at stat sheets and, review film and take specialty stats to inform them and to inform their decision making. But I think we've taken it so far right now to the point where, it kind of betrays the instinct of the game. For instance, and I use the 3-point shot as a great example. Yeah, the corner three, high percentage among 3-point shots positions. Yet it's still, we're still talking about 35% approximately. And it just pains me to see guys drive to the basket and, turn down layups for 2 points in order to kick the ball to somebody and turn in a 95% shot into a 35% shot. It just for one extra point. And people forget about the fact that by scoring close to the basket, you're forcing the defense to adjust. And when the defense adjusts, it's going to make those shots, 3-point shots, even easier because of the lack of challenge. I also think if people are going to take threes, why aren't you measuring, the difference between an inside-out three versus the lateral pass three or the three off the bounce? Because I guarantee you, without knowing the math, the inside-out three is probably an even higher percentage shot, and that's the way we used to play it in the ABA to a great extent. It was very rare that guys would go one-on-one and moves like the step back and others, weren't really utilized that much. And so again, getting the defense out of position is the name of the game for the offensive end. And if you can hit some mid-range shots, you throw the ball inside, you force the defense to adjust. And now a better ball movement will get you better shots. That's just one example, of metrics. And I think that there's no substitute for, basketball knowledge and intuition of how the game is played. And oftentimes, people have subordinated those virtues, if you will, and gone straight to the numbers, and they haven't panned out. A great example is what was just mentioned. Win shares. If Oscar and all of these guys are so far down from what you would expect, if you were using win shares during that time to measure, who would trade for this guy, who would want this guy to be on their team, would Oscar have ever gotten his championship by going to the Milwaukee Bucks, who they've traded for him based upon, metrics like win share, et cetera. So I think there's a balance that needs to be struck, but right now we're out of whack with regard to analytics and basketball. As far as young players to watch, I mean, just from a pure athleticism standpoint, the Ja Morants of the world, who are some of the others, some of the great 3-point shooters, but even they kind of go overboard a little bit. Trae Young will take too many threes. One of the things that bothers me when I watch NBA games is back and forth in tight game situations where guys, instead of looking to put pressure on the defense, they'll settle for threes. And part of it's because of instinct, because that's all they shoot and that's all they practice. And, you get to fatigue and you get down to the nub of the game, you're going to rely on instinct. And, there needs to be more practice. The lack of big men who can play with their backs to the basket. Very few guys can do that. That's why Jokic is phenomenal to watch, because he can play in the post. He finds a way to get a shot off. He jumps that high off the ground, but he's so wide and he's got such a good touch. And he's a threat when he's down low. And now his ability to pass the ball makes him an even greater threat. And then, I don't mind guys stepping outside to shoot, because sometimes the big man has to pull the big man away from the basket to shoot the ball. But you've got too many other guys like a Porzingis. That's all he does. At 7'1", why do I want a 7'1" guy shooting the ball 25, 30 feet from the basket when he's got an advantage that the defense has to take a look at? So, there's so many areas that, kind of make me shake my head in frustration in watching how the game is played, because basketball is a simple game.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I found my first gray hair the other day, and I was just joking with my girlfriend, because I'm born and raised in the Bay Area, so I'm a Golden State Warriors fan and have been forever. And it's because watching the Warriors play basketball sometimes is the most entertaining thing, but also drives me absolutely insane. 28.
I do like the way they move the ball, and
yeah,
they won't turn down mid-range shots.
They won't.
But occasionally you're right. Sometimes one-on-one, especially Steph. But how can you argue with his success?
I know. I love Steph, but I'm like, Steph, a 28-foot three ball with 2 seconds into the shot clock. I'm like, really? Yeah. But I appreciate your insight on it.
It's also when you take those shots. I don't think when the clock running down and them only needing 2 that he would settle for something like that. He's
Absolutely.
smarter than that.
But yeah, it drives me crazy sometimes. I love Jokic, by the way. Great. I'm glad you brought him up. The man needs more respect.
A good example of what you guys were talking about was just the other night with Minnesota and Memphis. Karl Anthony Towns, launching up threes. And all they needed to do was hold on to a 7-point lead, with 6 minutes to go. And they're all, he's launching threes, So anyway, we'll move on. You've done so many things. It's entirely impressive. Being a professional basketball player, which is probably one of the most elite clubs in the world. And then Harvard Business School. Excuse me, my apologies. Harvard Law School.
We like to make that distinction.
Right, of course. So of all the things you've accomplished, including your law career, what are some of the things you're most proud of?
Well, the first thing I'm most proud of is, my wife gave birth to 2 wonderful sons, who one's a Princeton graduate, the other's a Columbia Business School grad. Both of them are gainfully employed in areas, sectors that they truly enjoy and are making a difference, and understand their impact on society. And a lot of it comes from their mom and from me. So that's the thing I'm probably most proud of. The other thing is, again, getting through 10 years of professional basketball, and despite injuries, to be able to persevere and have a bit of an impact. I know that, after I got hurt in that 3rd year, I was kind of considered damaged goods and still got some time, but bounced around from team to team until I got to the New Jersey Nets. And suddenly I was forced to be a starter again. And, that was a team that was made up of a couple of old guys like myself, guy Clarence Foots Walker, and then a bunch of young players. Our front line was an all-Maryland front line, Buck Williams and Albert King and myself. And, I got there a game into the
Otis
season.
Birdsong there?
Yeah, OB was there. He was on the team. He was kind of one of the veterans that I spoke of, Ray Williams, the late Ray Williams. And, we were a hodgepodge team put together by Larry Brown, but somehow, with his coaching, and I would say that Larry Brown is the best pro coach I ever played for. We started out 2-13, got the gist of it, and wound up winning 44 games and made the playoffs that year with a bunch of young players, a lot of ACC tape flavor with Michael Corrin and Mike Jaminski, among others. And as I said, some cast-off guys like myself getting traded from Milwaukee there, and, guys that they drafted, and solid players like Buck. But, that's something I'm proud of, to be a starter. I played, I think, 79, 80 games that year. something I hadn't done in a while, and as a started all of those games. So, I'm proud that I could come back and have impact, average almost 10 points and 6 rebounds a game. My job was to play a high post and sometimes a low post and get the ball inside to rebound and to play defense against all the guys we talked about, including, Robert Parrish and Kevin McHale and, some of the other guys. And we won our share of games. And Kareem. We beat LA at our place. We beat the Celtics at our place. So we could say that, we won some significant games that year. So that was something I'm proud of as well. And then obviously my entry into law school and graduating from law school, my 9th year between the Nets and getting traded to the Knicks, I felt it was probably going to be the end, even though I had an 11th year on my contract. I decided I was going to take the LSATs, took a prep course and wound up taking the LSATs. It did reasonably well and applied to a bunch of law schools, got accepted to those. And interestingly enough, my girlfriend, who's now my wife, challenged me. And you're applying to all these schools you can get into. Try to challenge. Why don't you try for the best, Harvard? And I looked at her and said, come on, I'm not getting in there. She says, all right, well. And so I filled out the application anyway, sent it in. And lo and behold, we're in the playoffs against who? The Boston Celtics. And that week, I get a letter in the mail, my acceptance to Harvard Law School. And so when we're on the road, we're in Boston, I decided, okay, let's see what this is all about. We had an off day. I took the T over to Cambridge, walked around campus, had coffee in the square, just looked around and went through the library. And finally, I just decided, you know what? I don't need another year. I'm going. And I decided to take off. And my interest was always public interest, always, again, going back to that concept of being power for the powerless and voice for the voiceless. And, so when I got to Harvard, I represented tenants against landlords, predatory landlords. I represented the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination as an investigator. I was a third-year student working for the public defender. And it was there I decided I could be more proactive and, better at having impact by being a prosecutor. And so I wound up going to the Kings County, Brooklyn DA's office, my hometown, and worked there for 4 years. And the reason I got there is because I wrote a paper on Batson versus Kentucky, which was a case that eliminated the use of peremptory challenges, striking potential jurors for no reason. But a lot of prosecutors use it in racial terms. And the only prosecutor in America that filed an amicus in favor of that was Elizabeth Holtzman, who was my boss at the time. So I decided I could work for her. And so, those 4 years, I felt, extremely gratified. If you guys watch Law and Order, I'll tell you, it's pretty damn close to how we dealt. And I prosecuted police misconduct in my last term there, which is really important because many of the same issues back then, 35 years ago are what we're facing now. The only difference, it was harder for us to get convictions because today, we have video. Back then, it was the word of the complainant and witnesses against the police. And, the juries would give deference to the police officers as opposed to the complainants and the witnesses. But now with video evidence, et cetera, it's a little bit easier, and I emphasize a little bit easier to convict, bad actors based upon, the video evidence. So going through that, being an agent and doing the right thing by my players at the time before the business got so dirty that, I decided I didn't want any of that splash up on me and got out. Those are things that I'm really proud of as far as my accomplishments. And it all begins with education and the opportunity that education presents. And so now today as a teacher, I've amassed all of this institutional knowledge. I remember after I practiced law, I ran a couple of companies, an education technology company to try to democratize test prep. I ran iHoops for the NBA and the NCAA for a period of time before the NCAA lost interest and the NBA wanted to hijack the program to control the top high school students. But, all of those things point towards, a life that, I always want to try to give back, try to help make things better. And so, I guess when you aggregate all those accomplishments, that's what I'm most proud of. And that's why today as a teacher, I try to give that experience to my students and give them an opportunity to understand how important it is to have impact for the good.
Well, you've certainly had an impressive life so far. And we ask you all the meaningful stuff. And I really do appreciate you giving us all this time. It's thank you.
Well, like you said, it's a great Sunday afternoon. What a great time to spend it with you guys.
All righty.
All right, thanks.
All right. I'd like to thank Len Elmore for joining us for this special episode of HPP. Please make sure to check out our regular episode this week as we discuss the top senior prospects in the NBA draft.